Washington State has a fascinating history of citizen activism, especially when it comes to the initiative process, and a lot of colorful issues that have been dealt with by activists in the past. In order to get to where we are today, sometimes it's helpful to know where we've been. So let's get into it. Thank you for watching. My name's Glen Morgan, and this is We the Govern. So, as I mentioned earlier, I'm a fifth-generation Washingtonian. I love Washington. I always like to look at our state's history because I think that they don't teach history enough today, and a lot of it kind of gets buried in dusty old books that nobody's paying attention to anymore because it's not that exciting, and yet it really is exciting and interesting if you go back and look at it. So, let's talk about some of this history of Washington State and the initiative process. And it's kind of classic and relevant today because, as I've talked recently in a couple of my videos, there's this unusual effort by a group called Let's Go Washington, a PAC sponsored by Brian Haywood, that's going to be promoting 11 different initiatives to the legislature right now. And it's never been done before. It's really breaking new ground. A lot of people are getting involved and engaged in all these issues regarding good governance, cost of living, and dealing with crime and public safety in Washington State. So it's really an interesting set of initiatives, and it's worth looking at. And the history of Washington State, of course, is kind of a colorful one, but usually when people think about Washington State and its history, they think about logging and the early days of the settlers coming into Washington and dealing with the big dark woods and the huge forests here and trying to deal with how do you tame a wilderness like this and how do you build your little house in the middle of the deep dark woods. I mean, it looks like my dad's farm back in the day or my grandfather's farm, and hewing an existence out of the middle of all of this beautiful splendor and lots of natural resources, but also a pretty hard scrabble life, and it makes you fairly tough, and it makes you interested in engaging and not being afraid of doing a little extra hard work. And it's easy to forget when you look back and kind of through the lens of time. You know, here's a picture of what Tacoma looked like in 1894. A frontier town for sure, still beautiful Mount Rainier in the background, you know, Puget Sound, commerce was important. And at the same time, there was also great frustration with their political leaders because even though Washington State became a state in 1889, and it was only a few years into statehood when the people started to get restless and feel like their elected officials were not representing them on all the issues that they really wanted them to cover. And this led to an effort to create the initiative process, which was a very new idea in America at the time. Washington State was one of the first ones, and they started this initiative process. It took them about 15 years from the time the movement kind of got going. And you got to remember, at the same time, there was an effort for prohibition in this country. The women's suffrage was getting momentum, and in fact, Washington State had given women the right to vote in 1910, 10 years before the federal government did. So all of this was going on right around the same time, and so there was this strong effort to make it basically allow citizens to be engaged in the political process in a way they hadn't been before. It took 15 years, but they passed a constitutional amendment to allow the initiative and referendum process in 1912, and it's still there. Of course, at the time, there was opposition, and the opposition was mainly big, established industrial sort of interests at the time, timber, fishing, and the alcohol industries in particular. And it was also supported more by farmers and small businessmen, and just regular labor was also involved in supporting the initiative process. So it was a popular thing and a populist effort, but there were special interests that were opposing it then, just like there is today. Now, of course, one of the concerns was these interests, especially alcohol, they didn't want alcohol to be banned because the prohibition movement was quite strong, and their concern was well-founded because that's exactly what Washington State did, is jumped in and banned alcohol in 1914. That was one of their first initiatives, so that was a pretty legitimate concern. It was a very popular issue at the time, and that is one of the first initiatives that were passed. Also, interestingly enough, echoes of today and our history, because the people were also very upset about taxes, especially property taxes at the time. And there were efforts to limit the property taxes on average homesteads and homes and farms all across Washington State. And they passed these efforts, these initiatives in 1932, 1934, 1936, 1938. I mean, basically every 2 years they kept passing this. And the legislature finally just said, okay, we give up. And they actually changed the state constitution in 1940 to deal with that issue specifically. And so those things don't change that much. People's interests and objectives and goals as populist movements, oftentimes there's a thematic echo that continues throughout history. And of course, with alcohol being banned, you had pictures like this all over Washington State because there they go. They had to get rid of their alcohol. It was being banned, and it did stay that way until Prohibition ended at the federal level. And that was a fairly big deal in Washington. And yet, Washington was still this kind of frontier town, and you're still building the state capitol. I love this picture just from earlier in the 1900s as they're building the capitol, mining the stone from nearby, and putting these beautiful big buildings up in the woods in Olympia and on the hill overlooking Bud Bay. It's kind of an interesting view. But also, these citizen initiatives did a lot of interesting things. For example, the creation of public utilities. Local public utilities were very popular with people and viewed as a way for providing power and water at a much lower cost than big industrial entities that might be coming in and providing the same services at the time. Washington State was getting basically electrified at the time, and that's when my great uncle, I remember, built a water wheel out in Union, Washington, so he could power his home and some cabins that he had out there at the time because power didn't exist yet, and he did that in the 1920s. So this movement locally to create these local public utilities, that was created by citizen initiative. People were very frustrated about the election process and not being properly represented by it at the time. So multiple times in Washington State history, 1930 and 1956 specifically, the people got involved in demanding that redistricting reform occurred to give people more fair representation in Olympia. Also, not surprisingly, after World War II, there was a desire to give bonuses to veterans, for example. That was something that was passed by citizen initiative. The idea that drivers would be required to submit to breathalyzers if they were pulled over on suspicion of drunk driving, that was actually something that was created by citizen initiative. It wasn't passed by the legislature. I don't know how much alcohol they were consuming in Olympia at the time, but if it's anything like today, they probably were a little concerned it was going to bite a little too close to home. And it was the citizens that actually drove that idea home. In addition, one law that there's no way any elected official would have ever passed this at the time was the public records law, part of the Sunshine Laws in 1972, also citizen initiative again, which was the Open Public Meetings Act, the Public Records Act, and one of the best Public Records Act in America still to this day, and the Public Disclosure Commission, which is the campaign finance disclosure laws. All of these things came out of the citizen initiative process. Even into the 60s, there's waves of activism and populism that has gone through Washington State many times before, and it's kind of just funny that some of the things that ended up being a big deal and they were focused on at that time. In 1966, they basically repealed the laws that had been on the books for a long time in Washington State that would force businesses to close on Sundays. And this was an interesting initiative effort because it was started by the Young Democrats at the time, and they were trying to drive turnout for some of their candidates. And they actually joined forces with the Seventh-day Adventists, who were generally not, their religion really doesn't allow them to be involved in the political process. They made an exception for this one because they felt this was discriminatory against their members, and they engaged on it as well as other people. Very popular, and that was something that was done by citizen initiative. The blanket primary system in 1932, that was passed because they wanted to standardize some of the primaries, take away a little bit of power from the political parties at the time, and also make it so that people didn't have to register by party affiliation, which has been a long-term feeling in Washington State for quite some time. Also, the jungle primary, the top two primary system that we currently have today, that came out of a citizen initiative in 2004. And so these are just examples of different initiative ideas and kind of eclectic, but yet you see themes: taxes, removing restrictions on people's ability to participate in the business or the political process, and also elections. These are kind of the issues that oftentimes in history in Washington State and the initiative process that have been driving a lot of this. Now, one of the things in recent years, or in the last 20 some odd years, one thing that has changed versus the historic initiatives and referendums that were done in Washington State is this idea of the era of the paid signature gatherer. And this really came about, and the reason why you'd notice it more in modern times was because of a lawsuit that basically determined it would be illegal to prevent somebody from being paid to gather signatures at 1994. And so starting in the late 90s, paid signature gatherers became kind of a feature of some of the initiative process in Washington State. And some people hate it, some people love it. It really just depends on which side of the political spectrum you are at that given time on that given issue, usually. But 18 states right now allow paid signature gathering. There's about 26 of them that allow the initiative process in any form at all. And so so over half the states allow initiatives and referendum, but only a percentage of them, 18 of them, decide to allow paid signature gathering, which is something that makes it very different. However, despite the fact that paid signature gatherers are used in the majority of serious efforts to collect and get initiatives on the ballot or to send to the legislature or referendums, volunteer efforts still succeed even in this climate. And I'll just talk about a couple of them here as examples, because some of them you might know, some of them you might not, but they're relevant today when we look at some of the efforts that are going on. You can't possibly talk about initiatives in Washington State without talking about this guy, Tim Eyman, well known as an initiative guy pushing many initiatives successfully, a large number of initiatives, more successfully than anybody else in the history of the state of Washington, at least getting them on the ballot and getting them passed by the voters. And one of his first initiatives that he did entirely on his own, I-695, which was $30 car tabs. If you're watching this video and you lived in Washington State, 23 years ago, you probably voted for it. I know I did. And that initiative was originally not a paid signature gathering effort. That was a volunteer effort. And at the time, in 1999, he needed 179,000 signatures. And what he turned in was 514,000. I mean, more than 2 times what he needed. That was entirely done by volunteers, no paid signature gatherers. It's kind of funny because Eyman oftentimes uses paid signature gatherers and always has, I think, since that time. But one of his first efforts was done entirely by volunteers, so it's a very impressive effort. Also, voters approved it. It was overwhelmingly approved by voters, 56% that year. So that's kind of one of the more obvious, just all volunteer efforts. Another well-known one was in 2005. These characters here, this is Kirby Wilper and John Carlson, well-known local talk show hosts at the time, and this was in 2005, and they wanted to repeal a gas tax. It was Initiative 912, and Jane Milhouse was the sponsor. She's a well-known activist still to this day in Washington State, and so they proposed this idea about going out and repealing a gas tax through this initiative process. They needed 224,000 signatures to turn it in July, and they turned in over 400,000 signatures. Both John and Kirby have been promoting this effort on their radio show, and that really helped drive just a lot of people. A lot of people were interested. A lot of people were upset about that gas tax. Sounds familiar. And unfortunately, voters rejected it when it got on the ballot. But one of the reasons why they rejected it was this massive financial political campaign that came in funded by huge businesses and labor and establishment Republicans at the time, and just this massive established pushback against this initiative. And at the same time, a lawsuit was filed against Kirby and John Carlson, and it was actually initiated by Randy Gaylord, who's a prosecutor out of San Juan County, still there to this day, unfortunately. And they were attempting to make it illegal for people on talk show hosts to promote initiatives like this. And it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court rejected the lawsuit and upheld Kirby and John Carlson's right to free speech. But it was a big damper on the whole election process at the time, and it really served as a kind of an implied threat if you dare run a citizens initiative like this again against the powers that be, they will come in and punish you. Now, I'm going to point out that not only did the Supreme Court uphold this, but the legislature actually changed the law that allowed that type of a lawsuit to proceed. So that can't happen the same way today. But it is an interesting history in looking at that. Now, even more recently, just a couple years ago in 2020, we had Referendum 90. This was just another all-volunteer effort, no paid signature gatherers. I'm sure that a lot of people in the establishment didn't think this could happen, particularly under the climate that it was going on, but there was a bill passed that was very controversial, imposing some fairly radical sex education curriculum on kids in Washington State, particularly young kids. And so citizens went out and they were gathering signatures. I'm kind of rounding the numbers here because I'd have to double check my numbers on this, but they need about 125,000 signatures, give or take, by July 2nd. You had until July to get these signatures gathered, and they turned in way more than they needed. For a referendum, I believe this is one of the records that was set in the state of Washington, the number of signatures that they actually turned in at the time, well over 266,000, far more than they needed. It went on the ballot, But one of the problems has always been with referendums how confusing it is, because you basically collect all the signatures to get something on the ballot, and then you have to vote against it. And that's a very difficult thing for people to remember. But nevertheless, the bill was upheld by 59%, which is the opposite of what the referendum folk wanted to happen. But it was still a good example of how right in the middle of a massive COVID panic that was going on at the time, where there were no events that you could gather signatures at anywhere, these volunteers went out and found ways of collecting signatures using innovative drive-through signature gathering efforts at churches. One of the first times I've seen churches really get involved in this process recently. And so it was an interesting path to the process that you'd have to go through in just a very short window of time, just a few months, to collect all those signatures and get them turned in and successfully qualify for the ballot. So, who cares, right? I mean, that's great, Glenn. You care about history, and it's wonkish, and it's kind of interesting maybe, but who cares? What's the relevance for us today? Well, the relevance is that we're dealing with this really unusual, I think fairly unique project here, where we've got 11 initiatives to the legislature. Now, unlike a lot of the examples I just gave you, the time frame on when you have to collect these signatures is much longer. You have same large number of signatures that have to be gathered. 325,000 would have to be gathered, which means you get about 400,000 to be safe to turn them in. But you don't have to do that until December. That's when you actually turn them in. And these get submitted to the legislature. And of course, the point in doing this is that there's a general consensus or feeling that you're going to have a much more friendly, freedom and liberty oriented legislature this next session. And these are ideas that they could pass, that could fix things that are broken in Washington, that don't have big special interests behind them, but that the average people actually want to have happen: reducing gas taxes, reducing property taxes, improving public safety, improving just the function of government, all these basic issues. And Inslee can't veto them if the legislature approves them. So this is a grassroots-driven operation in a state in which there's a lot of interesting history doing exactly things like this. So maybe the first time that we've ever seen 11 going at the same time, crank it up to 11, right? If you're going to go big, go as big as possible. But it is something that there's a lot of history in populism and initiative process in Washington State. We're living in unique times. This is an interesting thing. So if you want to be engaged and involved in this process, I encourage you to go to Let's Go Washington, check them out, find out what they're doing, see if you want to be helpful in that process, be part of history in the making right now. But also, if you're just interested in the history, this is how we got here, and this isn't the first time that the people have decided that they're tired of what's going on in Olympia and they want some change. So the future, in my opinion, always belongs to those who show up. And if you want to show up and make a difference, now is the time.